Hello, I'm Will Sampson. Welcome to the Woodworking Network podcast. Welcome to the Woodworking Network podcast, where we explore the business of woodworking and what it takes to succeed. I'm Will Sampson. This episode is sponsored by the Executive Briefing Conference. Today, my guest is leadership expert Jim Bouchard. But before we get to Jim, let's talk a little about leadership in crisis. In the wake of the coronavirus outbreak, worldwide, we have all been facing a lot of unknowns. In the short term, what will we do to protect ourselves and our loved ones? In the longer term, what does it mean for our businesses and relationships? In the earlier days of the outbreak, I suspect most people in the United States treated the news coming out of China as a fairly isolated incident, far away and not much to worry about. My family paid a little closer attention as one of my daughters was living and working in Japan. She filled us in on the Asian perspective, the tales of the quarantined cruise ship that was docked in Japan, the spread of reported cases in the country, the shortage of protective masks, and actions taken to close some schools. She was teaching English in a private school that kept its doors open, but she had to undertake special measures such as regularly taking her temperature and actively disinfecting all the contact surfaces in the school. She was nearing the end of her contract and work visa, and we were already dealing with complications with her flight home. More recently, people across North America have seen the crisis come home with new cases reported daily, a whole raft of event cancellations or postponements, including major sporting events and panic buying that has emptied supermarket shelves of common items. On the business side, we have watched the stock market plummet and are faced with international and domestic supply issues. Some companies may be looking at temporary shutdowns or layoffs. The challenge is to act on all of these dynamic, constantly changing circumstances from a position of leadership rather than just managing. We have to look beyond the crisis of the day, taking action today that will put us in the best position for success in the future. Panic and knee-jerk reactions seldom have positive results over the long haul. Even if you need to act swiftly, do so decisively with a long-range plan in mind. Remember, no matter what happens, this too shall pass. Before we get to Jim Bouchard, let's pause for a word from our sponsor, the Executive Briefing Conference. EBC is a superior opportunity to learn, be inspired, and have face-to-face interchanges with top leaders in the industry. The 2020 EBC will be held at the spectacular Broadmoor in Colorado Springs. In addition to top speakers and presentations, including our guest today, Jim Bouchard, there also will be tours of concepts in millwork and the Mill woodworking training facility. It's an unparalleled opportunity to obtain business intelligence to improve your enterprise. You can learn more at executivebriefingconference.com.
As the continually changing news about the coronavirus pandemic unfolds, it is presenting not only medical challenges, but also business challenges. Here at the Woodworking Network, we were compelled by circumstances to postpone our combined Cabinets and Closets Conference and Expo and WoodPro Expo that had been slated to happen in Arlington, Texas. With lots of work and cooperation from the venue and hotel, we were able to reschedule the events to June. As government, colleges, and even professional sports organizations move to cancel or postpone events with large gatherings of people, this poses especially challenging issues for leadership. That's why I think it's so important to be able to have today's podcast guest on the program. Jim Bouchard is an internationally recognized expert on leadership who developed the Sensei leadership movement and has written several books and is a dynamic speaker with a compelling story to tell of overcoming adversity to become a leader in his own right. We had already scheduled Jim to be our keynote speaker for the Executive Briefing Conference later this year, but we thought it would be invaluable to get his advice now in the wake of recent events. Welcome to the Woodworking Network podcast, Jim.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances.
Well, leaders can't choose
That's
when
right.
they need to lead.
That's right. There it is.
Before we get into some of the specific leadership issues, can you give our listeners who aren't familiar with you a short rundown on your background?
Well, sure. Because you alluded to my colorful resume, I'll just touch on that a little bit. This adventure started as a college dropout, a drug addict. And I realized somewhere along the line that in order to have a happy and somewhat successful life, I had to transform myself. So somewhere along the way, martial arts came into the picture, and that was the tool for me, and taught me how to really embrace discipline and how to embrace some positive achievements in my life. And that led us eventually to the Sensei Leader Movement, which is really, now it's become a global movement to support and develop what we call human-centric leadership all over the world. And here we are, and that brought us together, right?
Absolutely. Well, this COVID-19 outbreak presents challenges that most of us haven't seen in our lifetimes. There have been a wide range of reactions from full panic to denial. Right. What's your advice for how leaders should approach a situation like this?
Well, there's the rub, isn't it? I mean, is panic productive? And that's a question we have to continually ask ourselves. And one of the things that's been coming up continually in our discussions is, how can we avoid that panic? And of course, the mechanism for that is how much information do we share, right? And a lot of times leaders are tempted to keep information close to the vest in order to avoid panic. But the vacuum that's created by a lack of information very seldom calms people, does it? It really can cause more panic than you're trying to prevent, because our minds just don't like a vacuum, do they? I mean, we respond to the laws of nature, and particularly when it comes with information. If there's a vacuum, all kinds of rumors and innuendo rush in to fill that void, and of course we've seen that, and that's why that's one of the problems that makes it so difficult to get people what they really need to respond to this. So I'd say you have to start with that, and of course let's bring it down to a microcosm, because we're not here to solve the issue on a global level. A lot of people have been criticizing the national leaders and the global leaders, so we'll save that for another day. But the important thing is, what can we do, each of us in our own organizations, like you guys did? You responded to that. I'm sure it was a very difficult decision to postpone that conference. People don't realize how many lives are affected by an event like that. If it has to be canceled or postponed, it's not just the people attending, right? It's the people that support that event on a commercial level, people that need that revenue as vendors, right down to the people that clean those venues and whatnot. So everybody's lives being affected. But it's to look inside and see, what can I do? But not to lose sight of that point about information. I believe, and again, I'm going to praise you guys. I think you did a good job with that. You responded early. You got a lot of information out there. And another thing that I think you did that's worthy of note, people can learn from, is that you did decide to postpone the event, not to cancel it outright. And that's important, because people now can make plans, right? This is going to end. There's no doubt about it. So you put it out on the horizon, and now people can make new plans. I think that was a very, very good move.
Well, we're always trying to look forward, and I think that's part of my approach on leadership, and our company's approach is trying to look ahead and to see how we can be proactive in things.
Right.
The communication that you mentioned is really essential. I mean, all this week it's been crazy hearing cancellations of major events, companies enacting travel bans. Mm-hmm. Besides just communicating, what can leaders do? Is there like a decision tree that you can recommend, or a process so that they can approach this in a non-panicked, deliberative way for these kinds of things?
Right, and not to cross into the management side, because my focus is on the human aspects of leadership, and that's critical, because especially in a situation like this, there's all kinds of processes that can be implemented, and there's lots of them that are sitting on the shelf, right? Most organizations have been through hard times before, and have created these processes. Hopefully they've archived them. That's one thing that we see sometimes, that an organization or leadership is turned over, and now you're facing a new challenge. Always hope you don't lose the lessons from history, right? that those things are documented and you can turn to those. But let's focus on the human side of it, because it's human beings that make all those processes work, whatever you decide to do. And the key to that, and the key to designing, if you have to design from scratch, or adapting if you're pulling those processes off the shelf, is involve as many people as you can that are impacted by your decisions. And I think that's one of the big mistakes we're seeing some of these organizations make. Because if you don't involve everyone who might be impacted, you're creating a much bigger problem. You're spreading the pain, over a greater territory. And that's where I refer specifically to, there are organizations that can weather this storm very comfortably. But if they're canceling an event or banning travel, like you said, it's fine to do that. It looks like it's a proactive move. But have you considered the impact on the people who needed to travel to make their living, right, to support their livelihood? And again, the people in support of whatever business that you're operating. So the big thing is to, involve everyone. And interestingly enough, we do a lot of work with credit union people. And an interesting challenge they have, anybody in banking and credit union space, they handle money. And money, believe it or not, is one of the most dangerous transmission devices for any kind of virus or pathogen, right? Like this. So you think about that on a very simple level. They're involving people, right? That it's believe me, janitor is a noble profession, and it's one of the best jobs I ever had. I talk about that a lot. But you think about it, in the course of our daily activity, sometimes don't worry about that's the janitor's job, right? But the janitors now are stepping up, the custodians, the maintenance people, because they're on the front lines of this. They have the information. How do we sanitize the facilities properly? How do we make sure, the restroom facilities are kept clean? How do we protect people that are handling the money, right? And make sure that we operate in a world of touch screens, right? So every time somebody touches a screen, that's a possibility of transmitting this virus. So again, it's to involve as many people as possible at all levels, anybody to be impacted. And I preach that always. It doesn't have to take a crisis to activate that strategy, because when you do that, it's amazing how many times they'll bring up small issues that you may not have seen from the top. And those are issues that could, cause huge problems later on, but you manage them when they're small. And so we can go back at one of the masters I like to quote so often, Lao Tzu, right? Is approach all problems when they're small. And when you do that, you prevent catastrophes down the line.
Yeah, acting early and being prepared certainly can help.
Yeah. And they have wonderful ideas. You don't know where the best idea is going to come from. So always, not just now, take the lesson later on, but always solicit, seek actively the advice and the great ideas from people at all levels. I mean, there's leaders at all levels. Don't you have great leaders right on your front lines? Right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
it has nothing to do with power or authority. Yeah, go ahead.
We talk a lot about lean manufacturing in our audience, and
right.
Most of that is based on the Toyota production system, and it talks about 7 kinds of waste, or muda, using the Japanese word. But a lot of folks in lean manufacturing have added an 8th waste, which is wasting the brain power of your employees.
Oh my goodness, right? I mean, studies have shown this pretty clearly, that the vast majority, and I've heard figures as high as 80 or 90%, of the intellectual capital, the experiential capital, and the cultural capital of your organization lives on the front lines. It lives in the ranks. And believe me, you can't create a manual thick enough to pass on all that information, right? That's peer-to-peer learning. It's peer-to-peer leadership that gets that across. And again, especially in a situation like this, I mean, when you watch it, you'll see how people, on those front lines will often be the first ones to join hands and collaborate and cooperate. So, yeah.
The next question I had is kind of related to what we've been talking about in the communication issues, but most of our audience are small business people and manufacturers.
Right.
At some point, they might be facing decisions about temporarily closing operations, or perhaps laying off staff. How do you approach those kinds of decisions?
Well, again, by involving everyone, especially with a small staff, and you have the complication. I call it the family effect, right? And you hear that all the time, I'm sure, when you're working with organizations like that, or a small department within a big organization. People they feel more like family with one another, and there's a few complications there. It's a good thing overall, but one thing, we can often get into a very casual type of relationship and form of communication with each other. And when something like this is going on, we have to be a little bit careful. Nerves are raw, right? People are worried. They're worried about the things you just talked about. So again, to involve them, to open up that discussion. I wish I could remember. I've been trying to find this story now for the last couple of years. I share it a lot, but I can't remember what the exact company was facing a huge layoff some time ago. And what they did is they called people from all levels. They had representatives from all levels of that organization. And they said, this is what we're facing. This is what we're thinking about. And they were facing a huge layoff. I think something like 1,500 people or so in that company. At the end of I think it was 2 or 3 days of meetings, and they came out of that, they never had to lay off a single person. They found that people from the front lines adapted. Some of them were going to, they had plans for retirement. Now, this is a good example. If you brought a bunch of people in a room today, let's go back a few days before coronavirus hit, and you said, okay, is there anybody planning to leave over the next couple of years? Well, who the heck is going to say, yeah, me, right? Very few people. They don't want to tip their hand and lose their job early. But when a situation like this is happening and you're saying, well, we might have to lay some people off. Are there some alternatives? Well, then you find that people step up and say, I was going to leave in a couple of years early, and you can structure programs to help them. The other thing with a small organization, and I face these challenges because I've never run a big organization. I've only had small businesses. It's first of all, it's always gratifying and surprising to hear the great ideas and how much people are willing to share. And by doing that, you might find that people will, they might work. Some companies are working remotely, so you got sharing hours for the time that people have to be on the floor. And you're talking about manufacturing to a large degree, right? People have to be there to do those jobs. But bring it to them and see what they come up with. And you might find they'll come up with remarkable solutions that, one or two of us at the top, sometimes we just can't anticipate. We can't wrap our heads around all the different situations that these people are facing. So it's good to get people together and again, share those ideas. We keep coming back to that fundamental, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
One of the things I know, you speak all over the place. And so your business is tied to events. And this virus, there have been people saying, oh, this is going to spell the end of big events. In our company, because so many of our audience are in shops or factories that they don't get out into the larger world as often as we think that they could benefit from talking to colleagues and competitors and all those kinds of things. What do you say to the folks that say, oh, this whole virus thing, it's going to spell the end of big events? Is that an overreaction? Once the virus is contained, won't we still need events to get face-to-face with people?
We can't let it spell the end of events. We just can't. Human beings are wired to cooperate with one another, to be with one another. We don't exist in a vacuum. And, we've seen some of the damaging effects, it's showing up in studies on children now. The isolation that's happening because, we now have a generation that grew up, they call it Generation I because they grew up with the smartphone, right? And grew up communicating, through text and whatnot. And we've seen the damaging effects. We can't let that happen. There's nothing that substitutes for face-to-face. And you're right. I mean, our business, we've been scrambling. Believe me, if I sound tired today, it's because we haven't had much sleep the last couple of days. We're adjusting and trying to deliver online, and that's good. It's good to have this technology. It's nice to be able to work remotely. It's nice to be able to. Colleges are shutting down and going to online learning. Yes,
we took some of the presenters from our show this week, and we did real quick webinars.
Right,
so
right.
They could get some of their information out, but that's still just not a substitute for face-to-face once things calm down and we can get back.
No. Like I said, we need one another and we need to be in the same room. There's no, I don't care if you're looking at an iMac, Retina screen, whatever the case may be, there's no amount of resolution on a screen that replaces you and I being in the same room. And, my appeal to people, I know right now people are being cautious about handshakes and hugs and whatnot. Well, once this is put behind us, oh my goodness, we have to get back to that, right? I mean, that's one of the most difficult things for me. if I'm doing excuse me, if I and dry cough up in the Northeast is not a sign of coronavirus; it's a sign of spring, right? So,
right.
So don't be alarmed if besides you can't catch it over the wire here, right? But anyway, to put it in perspective, no, I've been struggling with that because no, I like the handshakes and I like to give people hugs, and it would be a shame if we allowed this to end that forever. We won't. I mean, we've heard this song and dance before. When webinars were a new thing, that I'm showing my age, right? People thought that was the death of conferences, and it did contract them for a while. And I remember studies that came out that said, no, you don't get as much done online as you do face to face. It's not possible.
Yeah, no, it's our company runs basically a virtual office. We have people strewn all over the country, and so we use all of those electronic tools to work with each other. But it's essential that when we can, that we get together face to face and have meetings. We try to have a formal annual meeting for the company so everybody can get face to face. But at any of our events or events we attend, if there's more than a couple of us there, we try and get together and have a face to face. And it's just, there's no substitute for human contact, and the amount of data, just like you said, no matter what the display is, the amount of data that you can transfer between two people just looking eye to eye.
Exactly.
Way more than you get through electronic means.
No, and we all know it's very difficult to express true feelings and emotions through an email, right, or a text. But that's the thing too. And,
a lot of good ways to get in trouble.
Yeah. We'll share our communication. Go with the flow is our communication webinar. We'll share that with you because we dig into that pretty good. But the other part of it too is, I'm sure in the conference business, you've probably come across this study. There was a study done some time ago about what the most effective sessions are in conferences. Now, I'd love to say they're the Sensei Leader sessions, but I'm realistic. I don't have that big an ego to think that. They found that it's the networking sessions. It's the cocktail hours, right, where people let their hair down and just interact as human beings on a very human person-to-person level. And that's where you exchange. There's a more free exchange of ideas, right, and sharing. And just, sometimes it's just nice to be in the room with people who have had experiences that you're struggling with, and say, yeah, you're going to get through it, like what we're going through now, right?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that's one of the things that we've seen, particularly in the smaller shops in our audience. That I've visited hundreds of small woodworking operations over the years, and unfortunately, so many of them are all reinventing the same wheels that the other ones are reinventing. And if they could get together more often, they could share some of these solutions that they wouldn't have to work so hard to create.
No, and again, you had asked about how to face this challenge, and you'll find, but I want to emphasize again, not just in those small shops. When you break down, any large organization is just an amalgamation of smaller little divisions, right? I mean, eventually you're getting down to where you're working with a handful of people, and that's the way we're wired. And so when you get people together in a situation like this, and you ask them, how can we help each other get through this? You'll see this when we're in the same room. But whenever anyone presses me to summarize leadership in one idea, it's always this one that I lean on. It's leadership is sharing. A leader shares. So we've got to look for opportunities, right, to share, versus the hoarding that's been going on with this situation, and happens in sometimes in these things, right? How can we share? I remember some time ago in one of my martial arts centers where things were tight. There were layoffs going on at a local shipyard. It was a tough situation, and people were coming in and they were going to pull their kids out of the program, and adults were leaving the program, and we all got together and we said, what can we do? And we said, well, why not keep people in the building? And that meant we all had to pull back a little bit. We still had to pay our rent. We still had to pay our bills to keep the center operating. But we all pulled back and said, each of us can do with a little bit less. Let's keep these people involved, you see. And that's the type of conversation that happens when you're open with the folks in your family, if we want to look at it that way. And that's not a bad way to look at it, is it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
While we're on the subject of communication, one of the things I've been seeing with a lot of companies, granted most of them are retail kinds of operations, that they've been sending out messages to their customers, talking about how they're reacting to the virus, or cleaning more surfaces or whatever it is that they're doing. What do you think of those kinds of messages? Is it a good idea to do that kind of communication, or is there a better idea? What do you think?
Oh, no, I believe absolutely. And what I'll do is I just did a blog post on this yesterday. I'll share the link with you later so that you can distribute that if you like. And what you're talking about there, I've voiced it this way. I said, share your plans. At least the plans you have so far, right? That does provide some comfort to people. At least they know you're trying. Now, those things might change over time because we're responding, especially with something like this. I mean, we really don't know how this particular virus acts fully. I mean, they're still studying that. And now the flip side of that is sometimes people get frustrated and they start throwing blame around. And, that's something we really have to avoid. And we have to avoid it internally as well as externally. The facts of the matter here are this is a rapidly changing organism. They don't know how it behaves. It's brand new. That's why they call it the novel coronavirus, right? It is brand new. And I believe, by and large, our health officials have done a pretty good job trying to get us information. But when it changes in a couple of days, people get upset and they blame them. They say they're hiding things. Well, they may be. I don't know. But let's give the benefit of the doubt. We have to appreciate that situations are going to change. That information is going to change, right?
Well, especially because of the nature of this particular virus,
right?
And the incubation period. Today's knowledge about where the virus is really 14 days old.
Right, and right,
based on infections that happened 2 weeks ago.
And then it's complicated by and again, this is, don't believe me, believe scientists on this one, right? We have a natural tendency that causes negative impressions to be embedded more strongly than positive ones. And, and that's a problem because when we hear bad news, that goes in deep. And then when people start hearing better news, they'll tend to doubt it, right? So you've got to open your heart and open your mind, because sometimes, and one of the things here is the rate of lethality is going down. And I've heard people say, oh, they're lying. They're just trying to make us feel better. No, that's not it at all. What they're finding out, the reason that number particularly is adjusting right now is because they found out many, many more people had this thing, but just thought they had a cold or a flu, right?
Right. Well, and the amount of testing,
right,
relates, specifically to the statistical numbers as to, how much is lethal, and the more testing, then the lethality number goes way down.
Right, and it's not to be Pollyannish about it, but it's to take it in and analyze it, and at some point you do have to trust some sources, right? You and I are not, we're not physicians that study pathogens, right? So, we've got to trust somebody somewhere down the line here.
Absolutely. Well, once this is all over and the virus has run its course, what's your advice for leaders to prepare for any subsequent fallout or just the next crisis to come along? What can they learn and what can they do to make it better next time?
I am going to stray into management area for a little while, and that's a little bit, and I'm going to try not to get too deep into it, but this is more of a management thing. The human side of it is to you've got to recognize our tendency to forget, significant historical events, right? And those of us who forget history are doomed to repeat it. So the management part of that is document it, right? Whatever you're doing right now, document it. If you're creating procedures right now to handle this, and that's one of the big criticisms that people have of the way on a national level that we've handled this. They've been saying we were unprepared. And some of the physicians that I've heard talk about this, particularly those that worked at CDC and whatnot, they're saying we shouldn't have been, right? We shouldn't have our entire supply chain for critical medicines dependent on one country. We shouldn't have been caught blindsided with some of the simple procedures. So that's the thing. We've got to document it and make sure that, that gets put, there's no file cabinets anymore, right? It gets safely put on your hard drive and backed up. So when we face something like this again, you can pull that, go to those procedures, adapt them, and you're starting from a different point then, right? You've already made some decisions. You've already got some procedures in place. I think that's one big thing. The biggest thing, though, is again, and this is where my emphasis is. The best leaders, the most effective leaders, are those who inspire other people. They empower other people. They guide other people, right? And lead with courage and compassion. And that's really what we have to remember through something like this. Let's be compassionate. This is an opportunity to show people that you care. But if you don't bother. I always say that. I've got to qualify. If you don't care, don't bother. But, I've met I know we get criticized sometimes, but I've met very few leaders, particularly in business, who are not caring people, right? The bad apples are the exception, not the rule. But this is an opportunity. This tests the limits of our compassion when we're in a situation like this. And even if you have to do the worst, no caring leader I've ever met ever enjoys firing people or laying people off or cutting their pay, right? But all those things can be done, if necessary, with compassion, with by involving people and by being respectful of their feelings and their reactions. So let's just take care of one another. That's what it's all about.
Good advice, Jim. And on that note, I think I'm going to wrap it up for today, but I look forward to seeing you in person, face-to-face in November, if we don't cross paths in the Northeast sometime before then.
Well, I'm hoping this situation will be done by then. I look forward to meeting you all and having some good hugs and handshakes out in Colorado.
Sounds great, Jim. Thank you much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You can find all of our podcasts at woodworkingnetwork.com and in popular podcast channels. Thanks again to today's sponsor, the Executive Briefing Conference. If you have a comment or topic you'd like us to explore, contact me at will.sampson@woodworkingnetwork.com. Thanks for listening.